Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Preach with Peach podcast. Today, I have a very special guest. She is a retired mental health and relationship marriage counselor, I should say. She's a former professional volleyball player, internationally renowned volleyball player. She's also been an anchor on a news program, and she's now an online relationships coach. And as you can see, she's a very accomplished guest and good friend of mine as well. So I'm very, very glad to have Taylor Burrowes on. How are you, Taylor? How are you this evening for you?
I feel healthy. I feel refreshed. It's so nice to feel like that again, because I think there's been bugs going around and we've been like dealing with feeling sick and under the weather. So finally, I feel like we're turning around, and my sister's coming. I haven't seen her in 4 years. She's coming on Friday. So I'm in a really good mood and excited.
Oh, awesome. Oh, awesome. That must be good. 4 years is a long time. Like, Is there any particular reason? Has COVID been part of that, or is it just, life? And
we were just supposed to see them. She lives in Vancouver, right when it hit. And so we had the whole trip planned for the whole family to see my nephew graduate from high school. And that got deferred, and then Canada locked down. So she is coming through. So I'm excited to be able to see her. And yeah, I'll report back later. But sisters reunited this weekend. Dennis will have a nice estrogen-filled weekend.
Fantastic. Yeah, similar thing happened with us during COVID. Like, we haven't seen my wife's family in 2 years as well. And luckily, my parents have been, for people who don't know, my parents are in Thailand where I live at the moment. And it'd been 2 years, I think 19 months since I'd saw them. And we also, obviously, we'd been planning to get married in Indonesia, and then COVID happened and our whole wedding got cancelled. So it's similar situation. It's been a bit of a pain, but that's that. I want to say thank you very much for doing this in the morning for me as well. People that have been watching the other episodes I've done, every single one's been done at like 9-10 p.m. So I was drinking whiskey in a couple of them. Today I'm drinking coffee. I'm being much more responsible. So thanks for that, and more fresh as well.
Yeah, it looks like it's a great day. It's so sunny and you're in good spirits. So good catching you at this time.
It's the best time of year. It's cool in the evenings, cool in the mornings, and you still get the sun. So it's the best time of year by far. I like this time of year. Easy to sleep. That's the best thing. It's no 40 degree days. That's rough.
We did enjoy Thailand though, so we would like to come back eventually.
It's open now. You can get back as long as you're vaccinated, but it is open now for tourists. It's good. It's good to see people back here, because a lot of the economy relies on tourism, and like the whole of the city center where I live has been dead for like 2 years. It's been like a wasteland because that was kind of the tourist hub. All the restaurants closed, and just felt whenever you drove through, we're not kind of near there, but every time you drive through, it's like just entered into a ghost town, which used to be so vibrant. But people are trickling back. It's still not even close to before, but it's good. I'm happy to see things reopening. You're able to see your sister. England's fully open now, and hopefully this will continue. But that's another topic for another time, I think. Cool. So the first thing I really want to ask you, Taylor, is because you're now a relationship coach. You do something similar to myself. And this is your background as well, but historically you were a kind of in-person counselor, right? You were a therapist, a counselor in the kind of more traditional route, but you've transitioned now into this online modality. What kind of led you from that transition? What made you decide, okay, I want to kind of pack in this way of doing it in the past and restart and do a similar thing, but in a different vein, in a different medium online? What kind of led you to that process?
Well, at first it was a bit of logistics, right? Like I had differences of opinion with my boss at the time, and I'd worked with her for 10 years. So we tried to resolve our differences for a long time. And we eventually just sort of figured it might be easier for me to go my own way and do something on my own. And in the process of starting my own business, I tried to rent like a brick and mortar, and I still had my license at the time. And it was just so difficult that I wanted to work online to make ends meet and just stay active in the field. And then I eventually realized I didn't need my licenses, and most of my clients were overseas. And I planned on moving anyway. So I wanted to come over to Southeast Asia and do my traveling. And you can't do that with a license. You can't function doing like telehealth online across jurisdictions. Your license has to be specific for the jurisdiction, like of the person you're speaking to. So it didn't make any sense for me to keep my licenses. So I decided to retire and let them expire and just work as an independent consultant. I mean, there's obviously a line of, I'm not trying to do therapy with anybody, but just talking to someone and giving them advice, which can be a lot of talk therapy when you're dealing with highly functional people. But as long as you're not doing any kind of therapeutic modality with someone, and you're very clear that this isn't therapy, this is a different phenomenon, then that's okay. You're not, you're not limited. So some might say it's similar, but I think it's very different. I know I feel so much more at ease and being myself and being transparent and being very particular about the people that I work with is probably the best part, that I can just filter and vet my clients versus, obviously having to accept anybody that comes through the door when you're a therapist, basically.
Yeah, that you've mentioned this before to me about actually there's a big difference between like proper traditional therapy and what kind of you do now today. And for someone like me who has, I would say, probably a caricatured understanding of what therapy really is. I've never been to therapy. I've never, experienced it firsthand. Like, what would you say those kind of main differences are? Like, what is the kind of what is the difference, I suppose? Yeah.
Well, you're not playing, like, you're not yourself in the scenario. You're really playing a role, right? You're a tool where you have to make everything about the client and what the client, like, what is to their benefit. So it's difficult because you can have a different approach. Your personality can show through, but there are rules to therapy where you have to be more neutral. You have to be non-judgmental to a fault, I believe. You can't present a bias or a value system. So in the work that I do, it's values infused, and I'm just speaking for myself. I'm sure for you as well, you have certain values that you would project. But in a therapeutic setting, it's like when you go to the doctor a bit, right? Like when you go to the doctor, the patient comes first, and it should be what's right for the patient, and you're offering them a service that's for them. So it's protected by HIPAA laws, and health insurance is involved. So there's all those sort of practical matters, but how you do therapy can look different. So you might do just talk therapy, general questioning and reflection and active listening with your client in order to build rapport, and then search for the patterns in their history, their childhood, and their relationships. And it can be more generalized, or you can be very specific and do like EMDR or DBT or CBT or some combination of those, or lots of other things. But every modality is a little bit different, but the common factor is you as the professional. You're not yourself when you're doing therapy. You're not thinking about what you're hearing from your own perspective and responding to them as you would in your real life. You are sort of filtering that through a lens of objective, like very neutral reflections. I don't know. It's very hard to explain. I feel like I'm removed now from it. So now that I have internalized my new identity, it fits so much better for me to be myself with people, and to make that very clear that I'm not going to be hand-holding or just telling you what you want to hear or going too gently with you. I'm going to be more directive. I'm going to tell you what I really think. I'm going to expedite the process for you so that you don't have to waste 3 years, sort of dealing with your feelings about something before you get to a result.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting to me. Like, because so it makes complete sense, right? Like the fact that you have to be detached, you have to be like an impartial viewer in it, because it is a more kind of medical setting, as it were. It kind of, I think it's kind of the foundation is in that sphere, right? It's about kind of medical treatment in the scientific, rational kind of way of looking at things. But I personally can't imagine how you could really get like great success without imparting some kind of values to it. Like just the way that we experience life, the way that humans are, is we're not these detached, like fully rational beings. The way we view life, the way we live life is absolutely entwined with our values. Like this is something that I used to have some pushback in my sociology major, because sociology is very similar. It tried to become like a science, right? A social science, to give it more validity, when it's like about as far away from a science as anything could be. It's completely, everything within it is subjective. And I always used to say, when you're creating this kind of model where you're trying to be objective, you're creating a subjective modality. Like you're saying that this is the most positive way. This is a value judgment. You're saying this is the most positive way to help someone is by detaching from values. That in itself is a value judgment. So there's no such thing as being unbiased, right? Like,
right. And they're not. That's the thing. It's the covert bias of progressivism, which is embedded in the whole thing. So being permissive about what behaviors people want to live their life with, I mean, it's very hypocritical. So it was a very hard position. I think once I realized these things, it was very hard to stay in that role. So, I mean, there are therapists, like I know Dr. Sean Smith, he's on Twitter, and he's written the book, The Tactical Guide to Women. And I've had some conversations with him, and I know he is trying to change it from within, which is great. If you can do that, more power to you. I decided to leave. That was my route. And I think I made the right choice for me.
Yeah, and that's it. We've got to also consider what's right for us as well, which is, part of the values which I think should infuse within this kind of thing. You have to make it what's the right decision for you. Like, it's not always about the other way of, it's not always about other people, unfortunately, which some people don't like to hear. They think we should all be completely selfless, but that just doesn't work in reality. And on that point as well, I do think that having this new trend, right? This new trend, which I don't know, maybe it's older, but I'd imagine it's come through with the internet. Things like coaching as opposed to therapy. It does provide that alternative, right? And in some ways, it will provide like almost in the economic sense, a marketplace, right? It's two competing forces, and maybe people that, I'm sure therapy works for many people, and for them, they can take this route. But I also know many of my clients have been through therapy and didn't find it that useful, and find it way more useful working with me. And I'm sure it's the same with you. I'm sure you have plenty of people like that, because I've had people say that it just felt like just talking about the issue and never actually doing anything, and I'm sure some therapists are better than others, right? That's the other thing we've got to remember. We don't want to tar everyone with one brush, but
yeah, it reminds me of, again, just going to any other service, right? If you go to one chiropractor, it can be a different experience than going to another, or physical therapy or whatever. So yeah, it depends on the professional, but ultimately counseling was derivative of psychology. So my degree is in counseling and not psychology. And that was sort of the new kid on the block for a while. And then coaching was a derivative under counseling. So obviously there's the evolution of the profession, and this one is unregulated coaching, but you don't have to be a formal coach. So you can be a consultant, at least I am, so I'm using my formal expertise in a consultant way without having to really identify as a coach. But there are lots of schools online and in real life where they do the credentialing for coaching, but it is an issue with therapy, within the therapy world. Like there's a lot of animosity towards coaching. So there's a fine line, when it comes to what we actually do, and it not being as distinct as maybe people want it to be. But there is a big difference legally because it's not a healthcare service, and it's more just educational, and yeah, so it's private.
Yeah, that's and I'm sure there's a lot of bad coaches out there. Just to add clarity as well, I've also
Yeah.
heard some horror stories from clients about that as well, in specific situations. So yeah, it's cool. And one of the things that I found, like you mentioned, within that there is this element of progressivism, right? Kind of embedded within therapy, and one of the things that I think is quite a difference, at least from my theoretical perspective, is that like I almost see therapy as being more of a feminine response, right? It's more about, and again, you're the expert, you can tell me I'm absolutely wrong in this, I'm fine to hear that, but this is what my perspective is. It seems like it's more, having heard about it secondhand, it seems like it's more of a feminine response. It's more about talking about the issue, working these things out, sharing about it, working through your emotions, which has value and is something I also do in a way. Whereas I feel like coaching is more of a masculine response, that it is more like, okay, we're going to take direct action on certain areas. And as you work, this is how I run it. And as you work through those, we're going to talk about what you experience in that doing that. And as you get those shifts, as you get those changes, that's almost what solidifies the changes in my clients, is when they're actually doing things and seeing results. And then they get these kind of internal switches that come with the results, rather than just focusing on the kind of internal switches. Now, all my clients, bar like I've worked with like 2 or 3 women in the past, all my clients are men, right? So I do think there might be a difference there. Maybe therapy works better for women. I'm absolutely like open to that as well, that interpretation.
I like that you mentioned that, but it really does, to me, bring to mind how integration is the goal, right? So we want to have the healthy balance of both. So counseling, coaching, they should really work together, and without, being literal, I'm just saying being emotion focused and then being behavior focused. There's a way to do them both the right way with different clients. And that's what I find myself doing, is when I'm working with, let's just separate it into men and women. When I'm working with women, I definitely have to use more of the emotion focused stuff. And then I prefer focusing on the behavioral aspect, but having both and emphasizing the emotions with women is important, and doing both with men. We're actually, in my men's group, we're doing a heavy focus on emotional intelligence and empathy and perspective taking. We focus a lot on connection. And so connection requires all of those things. So if you're going to want to connect with women out there in the real world, let's practice it in our group with a bunch of men and me, and play it out. And so it's an experiential group where we're processing all of these real life dynamics in a small group of, let's say 20 guys and me.
Yeah, and that's good because it's kind of a safe setting as well for people as well. And yeah, I absolutely agree. Like you've got how to actually relate to someone, how to be able to make them feel as though you connect with them and that you understand them. As you say, that empathy is critical to succeeding with women, full stop. Like women want a guy who makes them feel special. That's how you make her, that's one of the ways you make her feel special, is by you make her feel understood. You understand her position. And if you are detached or you're hyper rational about everything, that's going to make it difficult, right? That's one of the big problems I see is the hyper rationality. It's useful in some aspects of life, but when it comes to relationships, being too rational is, we can get into some weeds here with things like the red pill and that, which is like hyper rationality. It's the removal of all emotion, which is incredibly unhealthy. So yeah, it's good. I think it's good that we have this new modality that is allowing people to get hopefully the results they need in their lives. Because that's a good transition point, because I don't know, I'm still quite young. Like I'm a young guy. I haven't experienced, I've only lived in this era, right? I was the transition between, the internet age, and we had mobile phones as kids, but not smartphones. But in the past, it seems like, and I know there is an element of nostalgia here that I think people miss out on. It seems like relationships the relationships between men and women, how to deal with these things, forming relationships, people forming relationships younger, seem to be more common than today. If I look at my parents' generation, my parents' friends, and then I look at my own friends, like my own generation, I'd say probably half of my generation are not paired off at this point, and they're, late 20s, early 30s, most of them, and half are. Whereas in my parents' generation, I'd say most were paired off pretty quickly. Do you think there has been like a real transition where it's actually people are finding it harder to get into relationships now? Do you think that's a thing, or is that just nostalgia? Do you think there has been a shift that the way people interact, the way people view relationships, view themselves, view each other, view their emotions? Like, do you think there has been a shift?
I think it's probably hard to tell because we're not really interacting with people in the same way anymore. We're still sort of siloed, maybe it's just me in the bubble that I've created for myself. But I mean, I've definitely heard of a lot of like engagements and weddings and pregnancies and stuff like that. So usually in periods of crisis, you will have a bit of a boom because you kind of get stuck in together. But I don't know. I am hopeful. I mean, I do think people should be less detached and more connected to the right people. So probably that wanderlust that happened for a while, where everyone, once they hit like college age, they would explore the world and take like so many years to find themselves. I do think that's starting to shift. I think people are localizing a little bit more. And so maybe that's contributing as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was listening to a Huntsman podcast, the Huntsman. Listening to a podcast about him, and obviously he's talking about logistics and the way that COVID has affected logistics. And one of the things he talks about is the reduction in optionality, right? Since COVID, like the supply chains, he's like, it's not going to be like World War II. We're not going to get rationing, right? The supply chains get hit, but we are going to see a reduction in the options, the optionality you have. Maybe instead of being able to buy like 10 different brands of cereal, you'll only have 3, or instead of being able to have 10 different cuts of steak, you're only going to have 3 cuts of steak, for example. Like, you're not going to starve, but that reduction in optionality is going to take place. And I see the same thing happening, as you say, as a result of COVID and things like travel restrictions for kids or, young, early 20s, late teenagers. There's no longer we had the whole world to choose from, my generation, right? We could do anything. And I did that. I went traveling for 6 months on my own. You had all these different options that you could choose. You could go traveling, you could go over here, you could pursue a job over here, you could go work in Spain for a year, you could go work in Thailand for a year. You can, you got all these different options that are very exciting, very attractive. Now it seems we're getting a reduction of those options, right? If you can't, until a month ago, you couldn't get into Thailand. Indonesia, which is my wife's Indonesian, another country I know a lot about. They've literally only just opened up to tourists again yesterday, I think, or maybe 2 days ago. So it's that reduction in optionality, I think, is gonna kind of produce almost a reshifting where people are going to focus more on the people around them and focus on what I think is more important, which are these kind of relationships and these connections that, I do think it's good for people to go out and go through a rite of passage and explore the world and mark that, especially for men. I think it's more important for men, is to mark that passage from boyhood to manhood. But I think people were taking it too far. Like I met people while I was traveling who've been traveling for 4 years on their own. And it's like, what are you doing at that point? You know what I mean? Like, what's the purpose at this point? And they're all, I'll be honest, they're all quite lost souls hiding it. But I think that reduction in optionality is going to be something interesting going forward, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I know where I'm from, the Cayman Islands, people would find themselves in Cayman working, they had real jobs wherever they were from, like, whatever you consider a real job, but then they wanted to take a year or 2 off and serve drinks in the Cayman Islands just for the experience. And then it's like, 7 years later. That was the amount of time that people would have with their visas. Sometimes I think one of the maximums is 7 years. So they'd end up staying there serving drinks for 7 years, even though they have a degree in something or whatever, which is not, I'm not speaking badly about it, but as long as they take the time to reflect, what is my ultimate goal here, and have some kind of intentionality to it, not just flailing about and, soaking up the sun and enjoying the lifestyle for no particular reason. But I think, now people, I'm not saying don't go to the Cayman Islands and do that, but you can definitely waste some time if you're not conscious of what you're trying to create in your life, and what you're trying to build, what your mission is, and where you're steering your ship, and what you want to be working on. So I just think that you have to do both, kind of enjoy yourself and have that opportunity, but also have a bit of a plan.
Yeah, for sure. It's got to be a short-term thing. I think those kind of when a rite of passage takes 7 years, it's not a rite of passage anymore. It's a lifestyle choice. And I think a big problem with that actually is that people don't go through those rite of passages at the right age. So I one thing you'll find is those kind of people who do go and decide to go serve drinks for 7 years in the Cayman Islands, like after, having a good job beforehand, is often they'll have gone straight from school, straight to university, straight into work without ever having that kind of partition from childhood to manhood, especially for womanhood. Because I think this is very common amongst teachers as well. I see it amongst teachers who will, I distinctly remember meeting a couple of different teachers who had been teachers and then quit and gone to work in Australia, for 2 years, or gone. I met one guy who was like 35 with a kid, and he was married, and he left his kid and his marriage to go work on a cruise ship. And I'm just like, for me, that's I can't kind of comprehend the thought process behind that. And he was a teacher as well. And I think it's this fact that they never had that demarcation at 18 to 21, 16 to 21, when it should be. And it should be a short-term thing where you go out, explore the world, but you don't even have to do that. But, you kind of develop into yourself by putting yourself in difficult circumstances that are not safe. A lot of these problems is you go to university, it's the safe option. I know this because I did it myself. I went to university, I finished my degree, and then it was like, what am I going to do after my degree? I'll just do a master's. It's just the safe option. There's virtually no chance I was getting rejected. Just get on with it. It's another year, safe. I'm doing something with my life. And luckily I decided after my master's to go. If I hadn't have done that, I think I'd have probably been in a similar boat. I think that's a real problem. People, especially in education, if you're a teacher, you're just always in education. Then it's not healthy.
Yeah, I was just, I did a reel yesterday, and I wrote an article too about the timeline for women, and how it's important for women not to sort of just go on that inertia of continuing school and not seeing the opportunity costs for them. I mean, it's one thing to do your undergrad and use the time when you're in your college years well. You don't want to just go and not invest in your future. You want to go and make the right connections, get involved in the right activities, and then you can make the most of it. But if you just continue on in school like I did, you'll be in my situation, which, I mean, I have a good life, but I think it's better if you can pause at that time and really focus on grounding yourself and creating that foundation of a healthy and happy, fulfilled life. And then you can go back to school if you want to continue on, especially for women, because it's just too valuable of a time in your life to, invest in the degree versus in yourself.
Yeah, I think so. It's that detachment from kind of biological realities. Unfortunately, it's an uncomfortable topic to talk about for people because it does create some element of anxiety in women. But unfortunately, that's just reality. Women do have a more time pressured period, right? It's just simply reality. And this used to be well known and well understood, but now it's almost like this trying to just be the same as men. It's kind of disregarding what is the reality of the situation. You are getting a situation where there's a generation of people who have made unfortunately, poor decisions. I don't actually blame them for it, because it's the cultural environment encourages them in certain ways, and they follow this, and then there comes a point where it's kind of a wake up moment, and that can be quite risky as well. There's risks attached with that.
I would say it's not just about childbearing, it's also about the quality of your relationships. It really puts you in a position where your options are limited, your priorities have been elsewhere, so you end up settling. The likelihood of ending up settling is higher. And, it might seem like it's all okay. And you're like, okay, so I've got my career, I've got my degree, I've got my husband, I've got, a great life. But then fast forward 10 years and it all falls apart. And then you got to start from scratch. And then, where are you left? So I think that's an underreported issue. Like, we talk about the biological, but then it's also, the quality of your relationships. And you and I both know, because we talk about this, is how to ensure, or at least increase your chances of having the high quality relationship that's going to take you the whole way. Most people don't take the time to really investigate what that requires, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the same with a lot of men as well. I think they don't realize it's different circumstances. It's a great point you made, by the way. I wholeheartedly agree. Even like there's a trope within kind of our scene on the manosphere that, you wait till you're 30, 35, and then you're peak sexual marketplace value. But that kind of just takes in the pure rational, pure biological route, not blending with the cultural roots, which is, if you've been long-term single by the time you're 30, 35, you might not have the skills to maintain a really high level relationship, because relationships take skills, being able to connect with a woman, being able to manage her, her cycles as she does peak and trough through a month, and being able to deal with that and make her feel comfortable in that situation is a skill, and it takes time to practice it. And if you've never done that, or you've never been connecting with women, you've been completely focused on your career and kind of disregarded women, I'll save that for later, I don't have time for that right now. I mean, a significant proportion of my clients are successful men who are 30 to 35 and have kind of waking up and realized, like, oh, I thought it was supposed to be easy at this point. And then like reality hits, and there's also time pressures for them, because this idea, historically, you could be, as a 35-year-old, you could probably get a 21-year-old woman. You probably could, even though I think that's probably not ideal for many reasons in terms of maturity and connection and being on the same life path. I think there's some advantages to it, but nowadays there's very few 21-year-old women who are going to want to go with a 35-year-old man and marry a 35 man and settle down with him at the very least. So maybe you really searching probably between 26 to 35, probably maybe 28 I think is more realistic, to 35. And again, these are going to be more experienced women who are going to want certain things from a man as well. And if you're not able to provide that because you haven't developed those skills, there is a pressure there on your quality of relationships as well. I think marrying young or reasonably young is optimal. I think growing up together, there's a huge amount to be said through going through trials together from a young age and developing those bonds as you grow together. I think that's also a way that you can mitigate the impacts of divorce. When you've grown together, you've created this bond when you've been together through both the bad times and the good times, rather than only just being there for the good times. There's a strength of connection there, which is undervalued. Like when we talk about sexual marketplace value, that is valuable. That a woman who's been loyal to you through those years has got more value to you as an individual than a woman 3 years younger than her who's more fertile, right?
Yeah, no, I can see how that's definitely, there's a parallel for the men there. But another thing, issue I would say with the older, not really older, but like 35 established man, mature man, then maybe dating a younger woman, is the younger woman, she needs excitement. She needs adventure. She needs to explore the world. And so if you've just done that and now you're at a place where you want to be more grounded and settled, but you want the younger woman, you have to be prepared to give her those bells and whistles and give her the attention. And it might feel very high maintenance to you, but you have to figure out these trade-offs. Like, what is really most important to you? And, how are you trying to establish your compatibility with this person, because they have different needs. So an older woman might have more like emotional needs, or they might be more of a finesse job, whereas the younger woman might seem high maintenance because she just literally is restless and needs to go out there and experience a lot of stuff. And if you're not going to do it, she's not going to stick around very long.
Yeah. And these are the nuances that Twitter doesn't take into account. Twitter's it's a great medium. I love the platform, but that's why you need to also be engaging with long form content if you are if you are on Twitter a lot, like I am myself. So these nuances are really, really important. So let's have a little transition then. Like, you recently put out, and it's kind of similar. We're talking about how to deal with the emotional needs and emotional responses. You recently put out a video about the 4 stress languages, which is, I think, something you've coined yourself. And I'm aware of the 5 love languages, which are ways in which certain people express their love, and certain people express love and feel more love in certain like through acts of giving, acts of service, etc. But I'm really interested in this topic. So what are the 4 stress languages, and how would you kind of articulate this idea?
Sure. Well, I've coined it as a stress language to fit it in with the love language. It's based on, obviously, my work in trauma and general therapeutic sort of content, where you talk about your stress response, or when you're feeling threatened, how do you respond to that threat to life? And so, especially with traumatized victims, they will have heightened states of this where it gets into the pathological level. So I really wanted to normalize it and package it in a way that anybody will be able to use these concepts in an adaptive way to help them in their relationships and help them manage those ebbs and flows in the emotional department. Because people often just have their rose-colored glasses on, and they're looking at, the 5 love languages are great and all, but there's so much more to figuring out how to sync up with your partner than what's their love language and how do I make them happy. So on the flip side, it's the contrast of when they're emotionally overwhelmed, when the shit hits the fan, when things are not so great. You better know what their stress language is. And you can vet for this from early on, right? Obviously, in the first 6 months, there might not be a lot of critical things happening, and you might be just enjoying a lot of the good stuff. But my suggestion is, don't escalate, don't commit further than, like, don't propose is what I mean. I don't mean like don't decide that you want to be exclusive, but don't propose or go that far before you've really uncovered what their stress language is in some kind of difficulty or emotionally overwhelming situation. So people generally have these 4 types. So it's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And then if you want to, the positive is like a functional stress language. So that would be the 5th if you want to figure out what the resolution is. But we all do these things. So it's not like there's something wrong with you if you do this. We all do them, and we all do multiple stress languages. We have multiple stress languages depending on what the situation is, but we do tend to default to like 1 or 2, kind of like with the love languages. We have the ones that are our go-tos. So it can be helpful when you're seeing someone, either they're withdrawing, right? They may be in the freeze stress language. If they avoid by becoming obsessed with other things, maybe their work, maybe they pushed you away and they want space. That's more the flight stress language. And then the fight one is just the defensiveness, and maybe they're a little bit more combative. They like to debate. They like to get to the conclusion that they want and have control. That's the one that's easiest to see the pathology, because that becomes abusive really quickly. So you need to be mindful of that, but there can be a time and a place where that's more adaptive, more appropriate to display that stress response, right? But in an innocuous situation with your partner, you don't want to be that combative. But the one that's the newest that people don't really know about is the fawning one, which is so relevant. Not just for women, because it's generally seen as like more of a female thing, but a lot of men fawn after women, they try to basically caretake and please the woman versus taking care of their own needs. So I think it is really interesting to see how people connect to this concept and how they can use it to understand themselves better and how they respond to that emotional overwhelm, and then how they're able to help comfort or resolve the tension with their partner when they notice they're doing their own stress language.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really, really good. And I think you're totally right on that fawning thing. There's definitely a big proportion of men who believe that they will be able to make things right by being nice, right? Or being kind to their partner, where in that situation, it's actually not the right thing to do. She's not looking, it comes across as weak, essentially. It comes across as ingratiating, and it actually will dent her respect for you if you go like that. And a lot of men have this modality where they think that their wife or their girlfriend will love them if they're just nice to them and do what they want, right? And that's really, really harmful. And I think this is on that area. And I think in all these things, I would say a big part of solving this is being able to enforce and set up boundaries. Would you kind of agree with that in how to deal with these things?
Yes, and one of I'll expand on my definition of boundaries is I qualify them as how you get your needs met.
Yes.
Right. So you have to know how you get your needs met. Like, how do you do that? And then you also need to know what contributions you need to give to your partner and helping them get their needs met, because, you know, you share a life together, they're connected. So it's not that you're meeting their needs for them, but you have a supportive role in contributing to that, and vice versa.
Yeah, I always like to kind of tell my clients, like, leadership within a relationship is being able to blend your needs with their needs. That's essentially what a leader, that's what I see the man's main role within a relationship is being able to take care of your own needs and make sure that your needs obviously be empathetic and you're not doing something that is hurtful or harmful to your partner. That's not what we're talking about here. It's not just do whatever you want, right? But it's being able to blend your needs with their needs, so you're both having an interdependent situation where you both feel better within the relationship. You're both having your needs met, and you're doing that together in whatever ways you can, and you're facilitating that process. And that's ultimately what I believe leadership within a relationship is.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's very collaborative. So collaboration is also seen as more of like a female quality, right? Versus the leadership from a masculine side. A lot of people think it's more like a unilateral leadership, but I see it as the combination of both, right? You have to have that authoritative approach, but also you have to collaborate with your team and your co-captain. So it takes both. Otherwise, you become that tyrant, and that's not good. So I think it's good that you talk about leadership with your clients, and it's an important and difficult thing to understand how to do.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you've not witnessed it, like I always like to use the metaphor of like within sports, because people, men understand sports, and you will see the greatest coaches, they know when to crack the whip, but they also know when to put their arm around, right? And if you don't think like men are collaborative, by the way, like just look at a sports team. Of course they're collaborative. Like, and what do you think we did when we hunted, right? Like we collaborated to do it. And sometimes, yes, part of that collaboration is the guy making a decision to save your life, right? Like, I'm gonna right now do something that that potentially might hurt you in the moment, but maybe I'll pull you out the way and throw you to the side. But maybe that's because there's a saber-toothed tiger coming for you, like to use a slightly over exaggerated metaphor, but it's true. And it's the same within relationships as well. Sometimes you do have to be hard, and like obviously not physical in that sense, like you don't want to throw them to the ground or something, but sometimes you do have to be like, okay, no, this is something that I don't think is right, and always have an explanation for why. By the way, that's a big problem that I think a lot of men have in these situations. They don't like something and they don't articulate why, right? It's really important to bring people along. Again, this is the collaborative side. The leadership side, in the kind of traditional leadership sense, is saying no and being strong and sticking to that. But the collaborative side is making her understand why you're saying no. Like a big issue a lot of people have today, I always use this example, is how do you like, if you're in a exclusive relationship, I don't think it's respectful for either of the parties to go off like and meet someone of the opposite sex alone, right?
Yes.
Like whether it's a man or a woman, I don't think it's respectful to your relationship. And nowadays there is a perspective that that's okay, right? It's okay for a girl to go and hang out with her guy friends, like, and just on her own with like 3 guys. Whereas I don't think that's okay personally.
No,
And
I don't either.
and if you want to have a healthy relationship, though, you can't just say, no, you can't do that. And then that's it, full stop. That's going to create resentment. That's going to make her feel like you're just caging her in, which is also not healthy. Instead, you want to be, no, I don't think that's the right thing because I don't think it's respectful to us. Like, imagine if like your mum went by, she knows we're in a relationship, and then she saw you like alone with another guy. How does that reflect on you? How does that reflect on me? How does that reflect on our relationship as a whole? What does that make us see? And then you're empathizing with that. You're giving some scenario which allows her to connect the dots, as it were. Metaphors and examples are very important for this, for making people understand. And then she'll maybe be more receptive to it. She might not like it in the moment, but she will, if she's a reasonable person, and this is part of the vetting process, something that I know you're big on. How do they respond to these kind of things as well, right? So I'll leave that to you. That's a good transition. Vetting. It's
Yes. Well, what do you want to know about my vetting?
well, it's you mentioned before, like last time we talked, for people who don't know, me and Taylor recorded this podcast about 3 months ago, and Gremlins got into the works. Last time we talked, you talked about a concept that I really liked, which was the idea of front loading a relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think you've kind of almost touched upon that concept before as well, talking about, don't get engaged before you've seen some trials, right? So this is one of those scenarios that I think is very common in coming up early, where it is a boundary. It's a boundary setting exercise where how do you navigate? Because when you were independent, you could do these things before you're in a relationship. And there's that transition period when you're in a relationship where you can't do what you used to be able to do because it's not respectful to the other person. How do you navigate these things, and how do you identify whether this is maybe a red flag or something that's a problem, and how would that lead you in kind of guiding your clients through whether this person is someone to commit to?
Yeah, I'm thinking of one particular case. Every client is in a different like point in the process. Either they're totally like single, there's nobody in their life, or they're talking to people online, or they're meeting people in real life, or they started dating and in a relationship. So this one in particular, I've seen the whole way through. And there's been little sticky points. And so he's been going through that process of, is this a red flag? Is this a yellow flag? There's lots of green flags. There's always green flags, but it's knowing when that threshold is crossed, when too many, boundary violations and how much disrespect has been dealt with. Do you always forgive? Is it always just, okay, so we talked about it, we resolved it, but then something similar happened? If there's a pattern of behavior here, then this is a bigger issue. But it's very easy for when you have feelings for someone and there's green flags, and the majority of the time it's going well, you kind of just excuse it and defer it, and then it keeps happening, right? So I think this is a really important point where you have to weigh your options in regards to, do I cut my losses or do I invest more? And I think part of that is really understanding that it takes two. And so you have to look at the response of the person, like what you're talking about. So are they able to invest as much as you in the relationship and make as much changes, or make as many changes as you would make as well? Are they not just apologetic, but are they respectful? Are they prioritizing the relationship? Do they communicate resentment, like you said, or entitlement and pushback? Or are they really trying to accommodate some new insights of recognizing that the relationship needs to be, it's like the relationship needs to be pedestalized, not like the person.
Yes.
But you have to really honor that commitment that you're making and change the way that you live your life. It's not just two single people living together, it's the relationship taking front and center stage. So once they're able to start to shift, right, it takes a while for their values maybe to shift. Then you can continue to extend and grow together. But I would say if the, sort of the same pattern, even if it's slightly different circumstances, happens over and over again, then there's not enough real change happening. It's more just, you know, shifting around the problem, but the real problem is you have a different value system around what standards you're going to have in a relationship. And if you can't establish it before marriage, don't fall for it's going to be different when we're married. Like that's a cope, if you want to call it that. That's not going to change it at all. It's going to make it worse.
Yeah, for sure. I've unfortunately seen this pattern amongst some friends and people that I'm close to, where there is this perception that just getting married is going to fix everything. Like once you're in the marriage, it's going to be a new stage of life and everything's going to be fine, and like these issues will resolve overnight, where it's the patterns established before marriage are going to continue after marriage. Like it's when it's friends and stuff, you can't be quite as, you don't want to get involved in somebody else's relationship as much, because that's a surefire way to fall out, unfortunately. So you just have to unfortunately let people learn that. I've taken some people aside, but in my experience, it's next to useless, honestly. I'll be honest. Some people will listen, but that's also probably why these patterns repeat. But anyway, that's another topic for another time. So I think that one of the things that you can tame within that is very important is, like, an apology is only an apology if it is accompanied by a change of behavior, right? Mm-hmm. So if something really upsets you, there's something you just really dislike in the way that your girlfriend, your boyfriend acts, and they are empathetic and understanding of that, and they apologize for it, but then continue, you have to realize that apology is just a conflict resolution rather than an actual apology and a change in behavior, right? It's just a way to remove that tension that's there and then carry on as before, which is not a healthy pattern. It's always one of the things one of the main green flags, I think, is someone who's willing to change and learn when they're wrong and understand. I think that above all else is the most important, and being able to actually enjoy their company is probably the most important thing for the success or not of a relationship.
Yeah, it's like assimilating information and evolving into something new and better, right? Like you really have to have that learning acquisition. If you just tiptoe around it, or you avoid scenarios, like it's hard to really, it's not a tangible thing all the time. But you do need to look for affirmative behavior, right? Like you're not just looking for the absence of red flags. You need to see the efforts made. And so of their own accord, if they're going out of their way to include you, or not be alone with the opposite sex, or just communicate that deference or respect, or it's a different behavior. And if you don't see those affirmative behaviors from them, I'm going to repeat the point, but it's really not enough to rest on you're avoiding the major disasters. Like you need to see the good stuff too.
Yeah, and when you do that, that's when the relationship will really bloom into something beautiful as well. It's the hard work that you have to do to really create those really deep levels of intimacy. Once you have started to shift your life, and you mentioned earlier putting like the relationship on the pedestal rather than the person. I completely agree with that. I like to say it's like a collective ego. That's what a relationship is. It's like a collective ego where two people become, separate from two individuals and become one in the Christian sense. But you become this shared ego, right? Where the relationship takes precedence over everything else. And when you start doing that, and once someone starts doing that for you, and you can see that, the depth of the bond you're going to have is I don't think anything can really equal it. I think probably the connection between parents and child can have something similar, but even that's different. Children are going to leave one day. They should fly the nest one day, guys. Like, I know that's becoming more and more of a problem in Western society, but like, children should leave one day. And if you don't develop these bonds before children come as well, when they do go and you're left in the kind of empty nest scenario, that's when you'll realize the relationship is probably not as strong as you thought it was as well. Whereas if you build these real bonds, when the children have gone, you've still got this really depth of intimacy that's going to give you a quality of life throughout life, like that's going to be unparalleled. I think nothing else can compare with that, having gone through all these things together with the relationship, you two as a couple being collectively doing things for each other. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
On the flip side, though, interesting, this popped up in my head. I've worked with some widowers, and they had, more happy, traditional, not classic traditional relationships, but I'm just saying, like, more traditional marriages. And in losing their wives, they probably had more blue pill, I guess, like they were more codependent or I don't even know if that's the right word, but they were more of the people pleaser, the caretaker, or, the nice guy. And after losing their wife, even though it was a happy marriage and they loved them dearly, they didn't actually have the same depth of intimacy that comes from being a better leader, right? For lack of a better word.
Yeah.
So it's the combination is what I'm saying, throwing in the caveat of it's not just being companions for a long time and going through strife, but it's being able to play the roles effectively of spouses in your, leadership roles that really cements the healthy intimacy that we're aiming for in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So to go back to the point about boundary setting, right? If we go back, like how you set those boundaries will actually lead to that kind of intimacy, right? The guy who's able to stand up and say, no, we're not doing that, and then explain why, he's going to have that healthy respect, because she is going to feel, because when men do that, by the way, women feel safe in your presence. They feel like, okay, this is someone who can take care of himself, take care of us, has his own being independent from us. But the thought behind it, the reason behind you maybe saying no and setting these boundaries has to be for the relationship, not necessarily for you, right? So you can't, this is why I say leadership is blending your needs and her needs. It's not putting your needs above all, but it's also not putting your needs below hers as well. Because that's, I think, one of the problems a lot of these guys have is they put their needs down, they ignore their needs, they don't take them. And then, if in this situation, they are in a widower situation, it's almost like they've lost themselves, right? You don't ever want to lose yourself in the relationship. You still want to be yourself, but blend it and have this, kind of collective ego, but both egos still should be separate. It's not like you're still an individual, right? You're still an individual within that. Yeah. Just to add some clarity on that.
So this segues to another point that I like to mention in regards to the vetting and teaching that to my clients is you are simultaneously vetting yourself when you're vetting the person that you're interested in and with, right? So you have to be aware of your own red flags, your own unhealthy behaviors that result from being in that dynamic. So if you're seeing yourself sort of slip into that role or doing things that are disconnecting you from yourself and your, personal power and the best of you, then you need to recognize, not project blame onto the other person because they're probably not doing anything intentionally, but you have to course correct. And if you can't course correct for whatever reason, you're vetting the relationship, right? Like you're vetting yourself, but not just the other person. So a lot of times people, when they think of vetting, they think judgment on another person, but it's not so much about that, but about the dynamic that the two of you share and your role in it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's really, I really like that idea as well. And it's hard. That's taking responsibility. right?
Mhm.
It's understanding that like you don't want to play you're never the victim within a relationship, because ultimately you have the power to change that relationship, and ultimately you have the power to leave that relationship as well. Like that's the ultimate power. So you should never be a victim of your wife or victim of your boyfriend even, um unless there is some serious abuse going on, right?
Right.
And that's a different scenario. We're not talking about, you know, that one dynamic. But being willing to take responsibility, it is really, really crucial as well, and both for the good and the bad. And understand that often a lot of guys will like to blame their girlfriend, their wife for the situation, not understanding that it's their own patterns of behavior which is both creating and sustaining that dynamic, right? Again, it goes back in many ways to boundary setting and what you are allowing to take place within the relationship through your behavior, through, you know, accepting these things and not pushing back on them, not setting boundaries. So it's why it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the qualities I would look for too, I mean, I'm thinking about in a woman as well, but it could go either way. So that effort to always want to bring your A game, like to always want to improve the next day is going to be, I'm going to be a better girlfriend, going to be a better boyfriend, spouse. That's so important. And if you don't sense that, then I think they lack enthusiasm for you, right? For the relationship. And that's a bad sign. It's complacency. It's, you know, sort of, just sort of accepting the status quo and not wanting to prioritize the relationship in a way like everybody else can get the best of you. But if you reserve only the leftovers for your relationship, I can promise you that relationship is not going to go anywhere. That's going to be a slow death into a very bad situation. So you want to make sure that the person is able to create a lifestyle where she reserves or he reserves the best of themselves for the relationship and for the family.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like the person you decide to marry or you decide to be with is a statement to the world. This is the most important person in my life. Treat them with that importance, right? Make them feel special, because they should be. If you're in a relationship with them, they are special by definition. Like this is why I get a bit frustrated with all the simp stuff. You're acting like a simp. It's like, mate, it's a simp if she's just some random girl. Yeah. And you're like making her feel special. Yeah. Then it's obviously simping. But if you're in a relationship, you're married to someone. Yeah, of course you're going to do that kind of behavior to make her feel special. And again, it's not to completely push down your own needs and only take care of theirs, but you should feel like the most important person that in your spouse's life. You should. Like
definitely. I agree with you. One other thing I wanted to ask your opinion on, and just to mention, I'm sure we're running out of time already, but when we talked about the vetting and sort of, you know, front loading that process so that you can clarify I guess the value of the relationship, like the merits of the relationship itself, not just feelings for the person, but do you really have what it takes in order to last? The flip side of this, which is the pushback I often get, so I wanted to see what your response was to it, from women, especially more traditional women, is, but why am I going to act like a wife to my boyfriend?
So I obviously don't work with women very much, so I never really kind of had that situation. And I do think that really does depend. Like in that situation, you've got to understand there's a different value system at play there, right? So in that situation, I would say that it's more just about testing their character and going through the trials and just seeing how they respond to those trials. Because I agree, if you have a proper traditional model, you can't really subset like a modern lens on it, because the way that the relationship goes is completely different. Actually, like I wrote an email about this a while back about the importance of traditional marriages. This is actually why marriages and the wedding ceremonies used to be so big and such an important event, in my opinion. Like I believe that they were a cultural vetting process. So when you're in the marriage scenario and you're trying to organize this huge event, invite many people, there's many different moving parts, there's cultural weight that you have to attach to certain things. And I went through this in my own marriage because my wife is from a traditional background, is what kind of gave me this kind of red light. I had to do things like go and ask for permission from her parents to get married. I had to do a ceremony where I had to speak in front of the elders of her ethnic group, right? And speak in them why I think it's good for me to marry their wife and take care of them. And in doing that, you kind of see the character of this man without, some of the modern kind of lenses of vetting. Now, this is one of the risks we have in trying to maintain a truly traditional model in the modern world, because we don't have these cultural vetting processes. We don't have these kind of enshrined within the way that we get married now. I doubt many situations have that. Another thing that like traditionally you'd have to do in a Christian culture, you'd have to have premarital counseling, right? That's the priest won't marry you without premarital counseling, which is where hopefully these kind of issues should come up. You should be able to discuss them as well. So I would, to those people, I actually agree with them and their sentiment, but I would also argue to them, unless they're going through a really true, like whole scale traditional process, you're not getting the full picture, right? So this is something that I've actually changed my opinion on in the past 6 to 9 months, maybe a year or so, because if you've got, and this is something I've seen Pat Stedman talk about as well, and he says, if you've got 1 foot in secular and 1 foot out of secular, you're lining yourself up for disaster. And I would argue that's probably a similar circumstance here. You don't have the cultural vetting, you don't have the processes to go through to find out who this person is without going through a modern vetting process. Mm-hmm. And then if you don't want to go through the modern vetting process, you're skipping a real essential part of what it takes to be in a committed relationship. So that's probably a bit of a mealy mouth way of saying I'm not sure how to actually respond, how to deal with that situation, but that's kind of how I would articulate the situation. Because again, I've actually been through that process. I've seen people other than me within my wife's family go through that process, and I've seen how if we talked about earlier, the wedding's not going to solve the issues. The problem the problems within a traditional environment leading up to the marriage and dealing with the wedding, I should say, are going to define how the marriage goes on, if that makes sense as well.
Yeah.
So
I really like the cultural vetting aspect. That's good to add to it too. And I see how the removal of that is definitely problematic. And I appreciate the talking about this, because when you talk about this online, you get the really divisive conversation happening, and it's like there's no nuance at all. But when I hear a lot of women throw that out there, to me, it sounds like a loophole. It sounds like a way to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
And most of them are not fully traditional. They're just sort of banking on this. I don't need to give them 100%. I'm going to keep them stringing along until I get a ring on it. And it just really lands like off color to me, or whatever the phrase is. I think there is definitely a purpose to holding back. Well, it's not really holding back. I don't even think that's the right way to describe it, but it's reserving the sanctity of what marriage brings for marriage. And if you have traditional values, you would have already have established that with each other and you share them. So you can still do the vetting process, even if it's modern vetting, without whatever that the marriage would, like you have to wait for marriage for sex or to move in together or whatever. Like, sure, take those things off the table because you both agree, but you can still have deference and patience and respect and prioritize your relationship. And if your partner is asking you, like setting a boundary, whether it's affirmative or negative, like if you're saying don't do this or do that, because, and you give a valid reason, because it's something that you're giving to the relationship to make it more healthy. If they're like, no, I'm going to reserve that for like when we're married, I think that's when it becomes just an excuse. I'm thinking of like whether it's like having opposite sex friends or something like that, I'm gonna
Yeah.
that's reserved for a husband, not a boyfriend or something. That just
Okay.
seems
Yeah.
convenient to me.
Yeah, I'd agree. That sounds like, yeah, as you say, a loophole for them to do what they want. And I would say that's definitely a red flag. I think these things as well, like you got to be really careful with like using ideal scenarios as avoidance mechanisms as well. A lot of people will do that, I think, where you will, there's this idealized picture of what a relationship should be or what the perfect person you want is or whatever it might be. And then you decide, okay, well, we're not able to do this one thing, so that means I'm not going to commit to it, or and then it just becomes a pattern of avoidance where it's just a way for a deeper issue to kind of manifest in a way that seems more acceptable, maybe to the person you're talking to, if they are more traditionally minded, like I am myself. But yeah, so you've got to be very, very careful in vetting what is the root cause of that as well, which is why it can be useful to have someone to talk to these things about. That's why there is value in that, because you may think that what you're doing, especially you read these things on Twitter and then you start applying them to your life and you think, I'm doing the right thing. I'm not gonna be with anyone who's not a virgin. I'm gonna if she wants I'm not going to do anything till marriage, whatever it might be. Or, she doesn't cook. So, I can't be with a woman who doesn't cook, whatever it might be. Like a woman who cooks is great. Don't get me wrong. But it's not, that shouldn't be a prerequisite. And if you're using that as a prerequisite when everything else is great, but, she doesn't cook, so I just can't do that. You're using that as an excuse to avoid connecting and committing to someone. So you've got to be very careful with these things. And, people are messy, right? People full stop are messy. We all have our quirks, we all have our eccentricities, we all have our issues, our problems. That's just universal. And when you get two people who are joining in this life and really trying to do what we talked about earlier about, put the relationship on a pedestal, collective ego, whatever we want to call it, that requires an intensive process of, shaping and molding, right? Mm-hmm. And that is hard, that is tough. It gets difficult at times, and sometimes it's hard to see the wood for the trees. So that's why there will always be a space for whether it's a therapist, counselor, or people like ourselves, because you can get a lot of knowledge about a book, but you can't necessarily apply it to yourself sometimes as well, which is why it's valuable, these things. How long have you got, Taylor? Have you got a hard out?
I don't know. Whenever Dennis comes home, it's dinner time. So
okay, so we'll think about closing up then. So yeah, okay, we'll close it up there. So where can people find you if they like what you've heard? Obviously, Taylor really knows what she's talking about. I've learned a lot from her personally. In my experiences, I've kind of grown into this field as well. We've known each other for a few years now. I've been reading your work for quite a while. So where can people find out about you? Where can they learn more about you? Where can they, if they want to work with you, where can they find you?
Sure. Well, Twitter is my main platform, but lately I've been spending a lot of time on Instagram. So I'm at Taylor Burrowes on either of those, but I have a Telegram channel that's obviously free, and that's active, and my YouTube channel, which, new video every week. So I would love people to subscribe there and engage. And I'm happy to answer your questions. I don't have DMs open on Twitter though. So you'll have to find me on one of the other mechanisms. But I am available to, answer some questions, and IM DMs, Instagram DMs, or just comments in general, or on Telegram.
Sure. Great. And I'll link everything under, in the description box of people, so you can find out where Taylor is through that. And for anyone who's also interested, I will also be putting a link to a free little gift if you want to get that under this video from me as well, to help hopefully improve your relationships as well. But yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for being on again, Taylor. It's a pleasure as always to speak with you. And until next time, thank you everyone, and we'll see you soon. Check out.